Good morning to all of you, students. My today's discussion is about a very interesting topic in research. That is the hypothesis in educational research. So, what is hypothesis? Hypothesis is nothing but it is a simple term. It is the assumption. It is the tentative solution about the future. It is the prediction about any problem, about any solution of any problem. Hypothesis is actually the tentative prediction or explanation about the relationship between the two variables. It is a systematic relationship. To find out any types of systematic relationship between two variables like dependent and independent variables, we have to assume about that relationship first. That assumption is called the hypothesis or the prediction about any problem under investigation. That is also called the hypothesis. So according to J.W. Base, the hypothesis is a tentative generalization, the validity of which remains tested. And according to J.T. Townsend, the hypothesis is suggested answer. That is the tentative. That is the assumption about any solution for a particular or specific problem under investigation. Now, the example of hypothesis. These are the example of hypothesis in the slide. Consumptions of sugary drinks every day leads to the obesity is an example of simple hypothesis. If we consume sugary drinks like milk, tea, coffee, Coca-Cola, Alimca, these are the sugary drinks. If we consumed it daily, then it leads to the obesity. This is just like an assumption. This is the hypothesis. And if a person gets 7 hours of sleep, then he feels less fatigue than if he sleeps less. It means if any person sleeps more, then he feels less fatigue. And if he sleeps less, then he feels more fatigue. That is actually the tentative solution. That is actually the assumption. That is a prediction about any problem to correlate the sleeping hours and the obesity. Mental health of cancer patient is poor than the sugar patient. This is the prediction, but it is not always true. There must be an exceptional case. You actually all know about the legendary person, very popular and famous person of our Indian cricket team, like Yuvraj Singh. He was actually suffering from lungs cancer. And during this treatment, he was so confident and his mental health was very good. That's why he recovered very faster. And the mental health of his cancer patient always not be true that his mental health will be poor than the sugar patient. And regular physical exercise lead to improve the mental well-being among the adult. If any adult regularly exercise, this exercise leads to improve the mental well-being. And techno-stress of computer students is not significantly differ from art students. This is also an example of hypothesis. Here, techno-stress is the variable. This hypothesis indicates that the computer students is not significantly differ from that of the art students in terms of techno-stress, but it may or may not be always true. That's why it is the hypothesis. So investigations will be required, research will be required to prove that. So before conducting any research, we have to frame hypothesis. Just like that, these are the hypotheses. Types of hypothesis. There are different types of hypothesis in educational research. Directional hypothesis, non-directional hypothesis, question from hypothesis, null hypothesis, prediction form and declarative form. All these are form of hypothesis, different types of hypothesis, but very popular term of hypothesis we all know when we go for conducting any research is that null hypothesis. This is the popular, very popular term, and we all know. When I just go through any journal, we just have seen that null hypothesis term as there. But directional hypothesis, non-directional and question from hypothesis is also similar and likewise that of null hypothesis. What these are? The directional hypothesis. Directional hypothesis, that means a variable included in the hypothesis, if the measurement of the variable goes to a particular direction, that means is mental health better, that means towards positive side, poor, downfall, that means negative side. That means any particular variable which is included in the hypothesis, if goes to a particular direction, either left or right, either above and below, or either high and low, that is called the directional hypothesis. If the measurement of any variable which is included in hypothesis, statement of hypothesis, will not go for any particular direction, or there will not be any probability of predicting the direction, then it is called the non-directional hypothesis. Suppose an example, the teaching aptitude of male trainee teacher, suppose B.Ed teacher, B.Ed trainees, teaching aptitude of male B.Ed trainees is better than that of the female B.Ed trainees. This term better indicate that the teaching aptitude is included in the statement of hypothesis and it goes to a particular direction. If it is poorer, then it will also go for a particular direction. And this type of directional hypothesis is the hypothesis of comparative study. That means teaching aptitude of male teacher trainee is better than that of, that means here a comparison between male trainee and female trainee. But if the directional hypothesis is a statement of relationship study, then this directional hypothesis will be in the form of just like this. There is a positive correlation. That means positive. This is for a particular direction. If it is negative, then it will also go for a particular direction. That means it is directional hypothesis. But if the statement is like that, there is a difference between teaching competency of male and female teachers. There is a difference. But the score of male teacher is higher or the score of female teacher is higher, it can't be predicted from that statement. Only you can predict there is a difference. Who one is higher, that cannot be predicted from the directional hypothesis. Similarly, this is a correlation between emotional maturity, this is the variable, and the mental health of secondary school student, teacher. This is the hypothesis of correlational study, and this hypothesis is non-directional hypothesis because there is a correlation, but we can't predict from that statement is there any high correlation or low or positive or negative correlation. That can be depend on the test, any statistical test implied regarding this hypothesis. Now time to know about null hypothesis, which is very important term which we all shown in this research paper, especially in the journal or different book chapter. The null hypothesis. Null means not. Null means avoid. Null means empty. No difference. It is denoted by actually H naught. That means no difference between the two categories. No difference between the observed and accepted frequency. And it is actually the negative statement. If, yes, this is a word, yes, this means positive. Yes, I am. That means positive. No, I am. That is the negative statement. Actually, null hypothesis is a negative statement. Just like that example, there is no significant difference. No, that is a negative statement. No significant difference of teaching competency between male and female teachers. Male and female teachers, there is a comparison between male and female. And what comparison? The teaching competency. And the difference is no difference. There is no difference. That means there is a comparative study. This statement is related to the comparative study, and this statement is related to correlational study. There is no significant correlation. From this statement, it is clear that it is negative because no significant correlation, that indicates the negative statement. And between emotional maturity and mental health, these are the two variables. Emotional maturity is one variable and mental health is also another variables. And the secondary school teachers. Now, question from hypothesis. Question can be arises from any part of your life. Likewise here, question can be arises from any area. So, any type of statement can be converted to question. Like that, if directional hypothesis are there and non-directional hypothesis and null hypothesis will also be there. If we want to convert these directional, non-directional and null hypothesis into question from hypothesis, this is possible. How is it possible? Just here. In the previous slide, directional hypothesis is the teaching aptitude of male trainee teacher is better than female trainee teacher. If we convert it to the question form, it is like that: is the teaching aptitude of male trainee is better than female trainee? And second one is that, is there any positive correlation? That means this is the question form hypothesis. This directional hypothesis is converted to question form hypothesis. And both non-directional hypothesis also can be converted to question form hypothesis, and null hypothesis also be converted. There is no significant relationship between male and female teacher. Is there any significant correlation? Now the time to know more about the null hypothesis, because null hypothesis is a very important part of educational research. So what is it? What is the characteristic of it, formation of it, and the testing of it? Now, null hypothesis, the special features are here. This is no difference and no relationship. This is the call null hypothesis. Just I'm telling just for 2 minutes. This is no difference, void, empty. That is called the no difference or no relationship. It helps in making the entire research process unbiased. Like that, I'm just asking you, which political parties you favor more? If your answer is, so actually I favor both these political parties, that answer is the unbiased answer. So the null hypothesis is just like that. It helps in making the entire research process objective, unbiased, and it challenges the research or alternative hypothesis but does not recognize it. It means actually the research or alternative hypothesis is just opposite that of the null hypothesis. If the null hypothesis is there is no significant difference of techno stress between boys and girl students, then the alternative hypothesis will be there is actually significant difference of techno stress between boys and girl students. So all the time null hypothesis actually challenges. If the null hypothesis H naught is rejected, then the alternative hypothesis automatically accepted. And simultaneously, if the null hypothesis accepted, then the alternative hypothesis will be rejected. And all time, null hypothesis should be tested at a particular level of significance. Just like that of level of significance, which is denoted by alpha. Maybe you have fixed it 0.05, that means 5% level of significance. Or it may be 0.01 or 0.1, that may be 10% level of significance or 1%. It can be tested clearly by appropriate statistical technique. That means after the formulation of hypothesis, and then for the clarification of that hypothesis, you have to use proper statistical technique. And variables should be mentioned clearly in the null hypothesis. Suppose I'm just telling you just before 2 minutes, there is no significant differences of technostress between male and female students. Technostress is the variable, and technostress will be measured in continuous scale here, and we just want to differentiate this measurement in between two categories, male and female. That means the variable must be included when we formulate any hypothesis. Just like directional, non-directional, null hypothesis or question from hypothesis, there must be variable. Research tool also be used, and that should be clarified in most of the null hypothesis. Suppose in case of the technostress is included in the null hypothesis. If we want to measure the technostress, we have to use the technostress scale or technostress questionnaire or any types of inventory to get the data, to collect the data, because without data you cannot analyze the data and you can't go to the solution for a particular hypothesis. So formulation of hypothesis is not the end point. The formulation of hypothesis with taking the variable and fixing a particular research tool and then analyzing the data and go to the solution is the end point. Now the finding of research if oppose the null hypothesis. Suppose you will get findings after analysis of data, you will get a result, and if this result do not support and if it oppose the null hypothesis, that means null hypothesis is rejected, and similarly alternative hypothesis will be accepted because they are opposite to each other. And similarly, if the findings do not oppose the null hypothesis, that means if it accepts the null hypothesis, then it is not rejected the research hypothesis, that means alternative hypothesis. Next is that functions of hypothesis. It is very important because what functions are there? Hypothesis makes or helps an observation and experiments possible. Actually, what hypothesis will form that assists and that helps to conduct the experiment in a possible manner. It becomes the start point of the investigation. After selection of the title, you must have to formulate a hypothesis for a quantitative study. And after selection of the title and extensive literature review, you formulate the hypothesis. Without formulating hypothesis, you can't go a single step. That's why it is the beginning point. It is the starting point of any investigation or any educational research. Hypothesis helps in verifying the observation, what you observe during the study, during your research, and this observation can be verified by the hypothesis. It helps in directing the inquiry in the right direction. You formulate a hypothesis in a particular manner. If you formulate it in a wrong manner, then we will go by wrong side. And if you will formulate a good hypothesis in a good manner, it will give you the good direction. Now, sources of hypothesis. To formulate the hypothesis, you must have to know about the source, from where you get the information to formulate a good hypothesis. There are lots of sources, but major sources are that you can get directly more information about this hypothesis from the journal and the statement of your problem. If you particularly fixed your problem, select your problem or the research title, then you have the idea to formulate the null hypothesis or any other types of hypothesis. And research literature will give you an idea about what type of hypothesis will be relevant for your study, what type of literature you searching to get in more information to construct a particular hypothesis which is relevant for your research. Pre-experience and personal experience is also useful source. If you have a particular source of experience and your self-experience, your personal experience will helpful or useful for your study. If suppose you want to make a hypothesis in your study, just like that, there is no significant differences of adjustment. If you have no idea about the adjustment psychology, then you do not get the particular data, because after framing the hypothesis, you will not construct a particular scale or buy any standardized scale which measure the adjustment, because adjustment is a variable and it includes in your formulated hypothesis. So the pre-experience and the personal experience is the major source for formulating any hypothesis. If you have less experience in your particular expertise field, like in psychology, that is the technostress I have just tell you just for few seconds or few minutes. Technostress is very relevant term in the modern educational era, because we all are using technology. If we want to assess the technostress and use it in your hypothesis, and if you have not any idea about technostress in the field of technology, you may go to your expert, you may consult with your guide, you may contact with the person who have more knowledge about that field. That is called the subject expert. Analogy. Suppose if any theory or principle which is applied to a particular field, and then you conduct the research and give a conclusion, and then all these things are applied to another field. This is called the analogy. In case of psychology, there is a principle, there is a theory. A different psychologists conduct their experiment with checking different animal, not man or human being. But after the applications of the principle and theory in the real field with taking the animal as their target, they construct a principle which is applicable to the other field, just like as education. And they construct the idea about teaching learning process, just like constructivism, just like Pavlov theory. So they first initially construct or formulate hypotheses or tentative solutions, then reached at a particular point of solution and it applied to another field. That is called the analogy. This is the source. You may use the source of any other area to another area. That means source of psychology may apply to the field of education. Source of technology may apply in the field of education, that is educational technology. That is called the analogy. It is the better source of hypothesis. And the data collection and analysis. If you collect the data about, suppose male and female, suppose science, arts and commerce, this will give an idea. This is the source, actually source, what you actually will go for, what you actually want to do. This is the source of hypothesis. Now, characteristic of good hypothesis. Very good characteristics are power of prediction. The hypothesis has a good power to predict about the future or tentative generalization or solution about a particular problem or investigation. Clauses to the observable things. Simplicity, clarity, testability, it must be testable. Relevant to the problem. If your research problem is different to that of the framed hypothesis, then this is not the characteristic of a good hypothesis. That means if you construct a hypothesis, this hypothesis should follow all that characteristic of good hypothesis. That means it must be clear, it have simple, you use it in the simple term, use simple language, it is testable and it's relevant to the problem, it is very specific and it's relevant to the available technique. That means if you frame a hypothesis which is to be tested and that should not be fitted in any other statistical technique which is to be tested to get a particular solution to reach at the specific problem. Now the consistency. If your hypothesis, what you framed is more flexible in nature, then there will be lots of direction it will give. Then in which direction you will go for, you cannot predict it. That's why it will be consistent. These are the characteristics of good hypothesis. Then how you formulate the hypothesis? Formulation of hypothesis is the major point in hypothesis. Before the formulation of hypothesis, you should have to know the following point, and you have to gain the knowledge, or you have to gain the idea about the following point. What is these types of hypothesis? You all about the idea, the types of hypothesis, directional, not directional, question form, null hypothesis, these are there, and the level of significance. Actually, the level of significance is nothing, but it is the probability of rejection of null hypothesis. This is actually the probability of rejecting the H naught which you consider, denoted by. This is the type 1 error, probability of type 1 error. This is denoted by alpha. And this alpha value is generally to be considered in the research, educational research, 0.05, 0.01, 0.1, likewise, etc. Critical region or rejection region. Critical region or rejection region is the region of a normal probability curve beyond a particular limit in which the population falls unlikely by chance only when the null hypothesis is assumed to be true. In the normal probability curve, there are two regions in the two sides. These are called the rejection region or critical region. Suppose in an achievement test, 34 is the cutoff marks or pass marks. If you get 32, you will not qualify it. This 32 is called the rejection point and the critical point. And the degree of freedom. Actually, degree of freedom is referred to the number of values which are free to vary, free to move. After we have given the number of restrictions imposed upon the data set. We impose restrictions. After imposing the restrictions, those values are free, move. These are called the degree of freedom. And tail of a test. Tail of a test, there are two types of tests. Tail, one tail and two tail. The tail of a test, two tail test is one two tail test. Two tail test with two critical regions in the two sides of a normal probability curve. If you will go with two critical regions, then called two tail. If you will go for one critical region either from left side or right side, it is called one tail test. If critical region in the one tail test is left hand side, it is called left tail test. And if the critical region in one tail test is right hand side, that is called the right tail test. Now, testing of hypothesis. You have now the idea about the hypothesis, different types of hypothesis, characteristic of good hypothesis, formulation of hypothesis, different types of hypothesis, and so on. And now is the time to know about how to test after the formulation of hypothesis. Now testing depends on the 5 steps which are involved. First one is that formulate a hypothesis. You formulate either null form, either researcher alternative form, either directional, non-directional or question form, whatever you formed. And then set up a suitable level of significance. Just I'm telling before few seconds. Level of significance means you have to fix your level, whether you will conduct or your research or you will test your hypothesis at 0.05 level or 0.01 level or 0.1 level of significance. Select test criterion and statistical technique. There are lots of statistics in educational research, but a particular statistics is applicable for your hypothesis which you framed. That statistics you have to be selected. Compute. After framing the hypothesis and select a particular level of significance and select a particular statistical technique, you will go for the computation or calculation of the data. Then after getting this result, you have to conclude, you have to make a decision about your result. What about during the decision? You have to remember what is the degree of freedom, what critical value you have to give a conclusion about your framed hypothesis. Now, these are the hypothesis testing method: Z test, T test, F test and chi-square test. Chi-square test is the non-parametric test and ZT and F test are the parametric test. These are not a part of here and we will discuss in the next classes. And now, after selecting the null hypothesis or framing the null hypothesis, you all will go for the analysis to clarify the hypothesis, because hypothesis is the part from where you get it after setting the objective of your research. So framing the objective, then setting the hypothesis, and then for clarification, after clarification of hypothesis, you will get the result and confirmation. So statistical hypothesis is nothing, but it is actually the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis together is called the statistical hypothesis. That is statistically verifiable. Now, after tested the statistical hypothesis, that means null or alternative hypothesis, there are 4 possible results. You will get any one. When we accept H1, that is the researcher hypothesis, H1, and if it is true, then there is no problem, it is the correct decision, as alternative hypothesis is true and we accept it. Similarly, if your null hypothesis accept, when null hypothesis is true, this is also a correct decision, there is not a problem. But problem is that if the acceptance of H1 when H0 is true, that means in first cases accept H1, H1 is true. But here acceptance of H1 but H0 is true, that means null hypothesis is true. Null hypothesis is true, that means alternative hypothesis should be rejected, but we accept it. That's why there is error. What types of error is there? Type 1 error. This is not a good decision, incorrect decision, that's why error is there. This is called type 1 error. In similar case, in case of B, suppose acceptance of H0 when it is true, there is no problem. But acceptance of H0 when H0 is true, H1 is true. H1 is the researcher hypothesis. If it is true, that means H0, that is null hypothesis, it is false. And acceptance of H0 when H1 is true, it is called type 2 error, because there must be error and this is not a correct decision and good decision. And these are the probable possible result or solution after testing the hypothesis, statistical hypothesis, whatever it may be, null hypothesis or alternative or researcher hypothesis. And this is the flowchart to know what about the idea of type 1 error and type 2 error in hypothesis testing. Because during the hypothesis testing, there may or may not be error. If there are error, what types of error are there? There are type 1 error, type 2 error. And when type 1 error? Type 1 error is here. When null hypothesis is true, that means H1 is false. This is similar. And rejection of H0, that is similar to acceptance of H1, because these are opposite. Because H0 is null hypothesis and H1 is alternative hypothesis. So type 1 error occur when H0 is true, when H0 reject, or H1 is false when H1 accepted. Type 1 error occur. Similarly, type 2 error occur when H0 false but H0 accepted, and H1 is true but it is rejected. That's why type 2 error occur. Thank you.